Okay, hello and welcome to this companion podcast on the use of warrants. So there were a number of questions that we did not have time to address yesterday, so we will do that today. And we have a list of all the questions here, and they are listed in the order that they have been upvoted on the platform. So we will go through them. We will go through all the questions. Some of them we addressed already in the session. The ones that we did, we'll kind of breeze through and then focus more attention to the ones that we did not. So we'll just do this casually. This is not scripted. This is a conversation. So what we'll do is we'll take turn asking questions and then we'll see how that goes. How does that sound, Saku?
Sounds good. You need to know that you're phasing in and out of existence like the ghost of Christmas past, but I think that could be entertaining to the
Really?
audience. Yeah,
Okay.
a little bit, but don't. I think that's kind of sweet.
Okay. I have
Yeah,
wet
yeah.
fingers.
Can
Yeah.
you see that happening? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
I'll do the
So,
first question. Yeah. So I think we may have answered this yesterday already, but just to refresh our memories, how should we make slash help reviewers to raise the issue discussed in the paper? How so? Is there a checklist? And
yeah.
yes, sort of there is. So as a checklist, we're not suggesting you to adopt a new orthodoxy on how you should do things, but sort of just kind of as a bare minimum of scientific work, the evaluation of a scientific argument, we should understand three things. So the first thing is what is the claim? So
hmm
in an empirical paper, the claim is a theoretical contribution typically. So our contributions tend to be theoretical. So what do we know now that we didn't know before we read this paper? And obviously, a part of evaluating the claim is that is the claim novel? So has somebody else done that already?
hmm
The second issue is then sort of just descriptively, what do the authors say about why the claim is warranted on the basis of or justified on the basis of their empirical design, their data, and sort of how that data has been collected. Is it longitudinal? Is it blah blah blah, qualitative, quantitative, and the type of question they're asking. Sort of why is it that they feel that this data and their analysis of the data um, justifies the claim that they're making. That's the second thing. The third thing is then the prescriptive aspect that do we accept that that justification? So is
hmm
the warrant appropriate um, for such a claim, which is then perhaps the well, in some cases, just understanding is the hardest part, but sort of that is truly specific, as we talked about Feuerabend and the idea of sort of being the method needing to be appropriate for what is being done. For instance, in the case of the traveling nurses in Mikko's example, oftentimes the appropriate warrant requires some pretty in-depth understanding of of the empirical context. So what is it that sort of we want to do? So those are the three things, and I would say that sort of if I see those three things as a reviewer, I should be happy. So
hmm
if I go beyond that, if I say that, for instance, I think we're doing too much quantitative research, or I think that sort of multiple case studies are overrated, that's science policy. So then I'm actually sort of acting outside the scope of my mandate as a reviewer. So if I feel that these three things are more or less clear, and I would have to say that it's actually very rare to see that even in published papers, and even in a super good outlet like the ASQ, which I often read with a lot of reverence and awe. Still, sort of, if me and my students we read a paper, so there are holes even in a published paper. So we can always do a little bit better. So
Yeah.
I would say that this is those three things that I would put in a checklist. Mikko, do you more
Yeah.
or less
Yeah.
agree?
Yeah. So we start with trying to identify the claim, and going back to the Schwinn example, these claims that are made here are about a particular case. But usually, when we make claims, we don't make claims about an individual firm. We make claims that look like this. Actually, the Schwinn claim, Williamson's claim, is actually a special case of, this is the general claim that comes out of transaction cost economics. The transaction supported by specific assets should be internalized. So the idea of vertical restraints linking to some notion of specificity, that's the claim that we're making. Okay, so first of all, we need to understand what that claim is. And then the question, what warrants that claim? Okay, so we obviously need some empirical material. You know, this was kind of explicit in yesterday's conversation that we're talking about empirical research. Okay, we know that there are non-empirical methods, simulation and such, but yesterday's talk was really about empirical claims made in the context of empirical research. So, of course, we need to understand the grounds as well. We need to look at, are the data reliable and valid? You know, all that stuff that we do as matter of methodology. Of course, we need to check out whether because if we can't conclude that the data are valid, then evaluating the argument becomes a moot point. It really isn't necessary. But this question, you know, what warrants the claim? What are the bridge principles that we need to bridge the grounds with the claims? And then the question, and this actually links to one of the questions that I can see on the list later, but let me make that connection now. Somebody asked, what do I do if somebody rejects my warrant? Okay, well, of course, warrants should never be automatically accepted. We need to understand what their backings are. So insofar as a warrant has a backing, then if you're going to challenge it, if you're going to reject it, you have to be able to argue that the backing is not valid.
Yeah,
Okay?
right. So, for instance, in the cases of your traveling nurses, so it's a pretty good background that understanding that or backing that sort of people shouldn't die. So it's more important for people to stay alive than say be happy as customers or you know the organization to be efficient, and sort of that you have to understand, you know, by the nature of the activity that the nurses are doing, and then sort of the demand that you have for that system. Yeah.
Absolutely. We know that healthcare systems operate with scarce resources, you know, not just scarce, but they're under-resourced in many. So improving productivity is an imperative on the system, because if you can't improve, that's going to deteriorate the quality of care. And if the quality of care deteriorates, then, you know, any notion of customer or patient satisfaction or employee satisfaction, employee turnover, again, becomes a moot point. But this is all about looking at the warrant and then looking at the backing for the warrant as well. So like Toulmin said, warrants are never self-validating. They need to be evaluated. Their credibility needs to be evaluated. So
and this links very nicely with, I think, the Feuerabend, you know, thing. You know, the anything goes exclamation, which some people take as a cynical. Actually, you know, regrettably, many people who haven't read the book take as a cynical kind of, you know, form of relativism that, you know, just do whatever. But sort of this is the exact opposite of doing whatever. Sort of it's doing what is most appropriate, understanding the scientific practice in question. And so scientific practice is diverse and plural, and often these contexts are very, very, very complex, and you have to appreciate that context. So that's, you know, actually translates very well to the notion that warrants aren't just these isolated ritualistic rules of thumb that we've come to accept and then just don't want to think about, but they have to be rooted in what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, probably all of us were taught in elementary school, middle school, high school that there's something called the scientific method. But in reality, there isn't. Even if you talk to a physicist, they will say there is no such thing as the scientific method. So the idea that we have this set of principles that help us go in an objective way from the grounds to the claims. That simply isn't true. And we can't base our methodology on things that aren't true in this sense.
It's important to kind of drill down the idea that the notion of against method is the against of the singular notion of there being a singular transcendental scientific method. So there's nothing in that argument which says that methodological work is unnecessary. So it's the exact opposite, that sort of all the effort that scientists are putting into methodology, is appropriate, for that practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and Feyerabend's notion "anything goes" this is what he wanted to say. If you think there's a scientific method, go out there and find it for me. Because if you go and try to find it, you're going to come back and you're going to say, you know what I found out? I found out that anything goes, which means that, the practices are so diverse, it's so local, that there is no such thing as the method. All right.
Okay, cool. So I think we have exhausted the first question.
Yeah, certainly. Okay.
So do you want to do the second?
Okay, so the second one is, how do we motivate authors to make their argument structures more explicit? Okay. Well, let me go back to this moment of reflection slide. Okay, if you don't make it explicit, these are the problems you're going to face. I think we should be encouraged by these points alone. If I'm having a conversation or a debate, and let's say you make a claim of some kind, I want to understand whether I agree or disagree with the claim. First of all, I should probably try to set that aside often. My task as an evaluator is not to determine whether I agree or disagree with your claim. My task is to determine whether your argument is credible. And I can't evaluate that unless you make your argument explicit. Okay. Now, should we always bring all the warrants that we use to the table? This is not a yes/no issue. I mean, Toulmin said this as well. And a lot of the things that we discuss here, we actually elaborate in the manuscript as well. So you will find more details and references in that. But this is not a yes or no issue. This is not either no warrants or all the warrants. But how about starting with the central ones? Here are the central warrants in the Schwinn case. There are actually, there are 4 of them. There are 4 of them, 2 in each. If we explicate these 2, there are probably a half a dozen others at least in both, but these are the central ones. So if you want to understand the efficiency argument, you need to understand the analogy of treating the firm as if it were a governance structure, and the notion of vertical restraint, the function of vertical restraint being coordination. Those 2 warrants will be sufficient for me to make the case that interpreting vertical restraints in the supply chain can be interpreted as benign. Same thing with the antitrust. 2 warrants are sufficient. You don't have to lay them out, all of them, but I think that through practice we will learn to identify the warrants that need to be made explicit. Same thing with the home care case. I think this is sufficient. We didn't call these warrants. This is actually something called conflict resolution diagram, or evaporating cloud from design science. But the principle is the same. We're making the warrants explicit here. We don't use the word warrant, but the sentiment is clearly there. The practice is clearly there.
Yeah. So I guess the key thing is that sort of all discussion will end if you start looking at all the possible warrants for everything. So you do need to understand the central ones, and again, what the central ones are depends on the design of the study and what is being done. So it is a form of negotiation between the reviewers and the authors. So as said, sort of this is real life. and obviously it's going to be imperfect, but sort of, what we're pushing back against is the dismissal of the issue of argument justification, and the reliance on external crutches that really aren't justified in any explicit way. So I suppose this is the main sentiment here. It kind of reminds me, the question about how do we motivate authors to do this. So I had a discussion with a colleague some time ago, a very successful colleague, and we were talking about how do we respond to reviewers' letters, and I noted that for me, doing what the reviewers want me to do is not my job as an author. So, and for me, the job is really to find how I feel that the paper needs to be improved based on the reviewer comments. And they're not perfect, they're not the voice of God. And my colleague responded, well, for me, for my sake, I like to get published, so I do what the
Sure.
reviewers want. So so I think that's a part of the one endemic issue of the current scientific enterprise, that we're so focused on just getting published often.
Yeah,
that
yeah,
we're not, we've lost some of the pride in our work. That it's actually us who are responsible for
yeah,
the claims that we put out there. So
absolutely.
even if we get a pass, we get an easy pass. Sometimes it happens when you sort of have a lot of papers out in the process, and sometimes once in a while you get an easy set of reviewers who just like the claim. Like Suzanne has sort of talked a lot about that sort of that we have this tendency of liking certain kinds of theoretical arguments, and that can even happen that you get lucky with the editor and the reviewers, and they just want to publish a paper such
Yeah,
as yours.
they like what you like. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't want to sound rude, but I always put candor before politeness. I have nothing to say to people who just want to get published. I don't have anything to say to you. If your goal is just to get published, I have nothing to say to you. Then I'd say just play the game. Just play the game. But if you want to really genuinely understand the structure of arguments, how we evaluate them from a methodological, not from a sociology of science or that perspective, but from the perspective of methodology, then I'm eager to have a conversation. But if publishing is just a game, and if you just want to get the citations and the publications, I'm afraid I don't have my, and probably even reading this article is a waste of time, because this ultimately isn't about getting published. We have no trouble getting published without invoking Toolman. We have plenty of evidence of that, but this is a methodological conversation. All right.
Okay.
So,
Nice. So the next question is, how does the concept of warrant presented here resembles the notion of objective or criterion in decision theory? Your provision case, as it was presented, looks like a classical by criteria routing assignment problem. Am I missing something? So Nico, this is clearly for you.
Yeah, I don't think the person is missing anything. I think that in the context of this kind of research, intervention-based research, we're trying to optimize a system. Yes, these are the warrants, the efficient use of travel time and leveling caregiver capacity. Those are warrants. They operate as warrants in this research design. But one of the points I wanted to make was that these two are mutually exclusive. You can't optimize the system using both of these criteria. And this was I think we went through this but let me just reiterate. Having gone to Mrs. Johnson's home at 8 a.m. to administer the insulin shot, if Mr. Williamson lives next door and needs a bath, the caregiver is prohibited from visiting Mr. Williams. The nurse has to come back at a later time, at a non-peak time, so that the capacity, the demand will be leveled. So this is not a by criteria routing problem. This is having to choose one. Which one do you choose? And there's a long story into why we ended up choosing the capacity warrant instead of the travel time warrant. And it has to do with many issues. So if you're interested in reading more, take a look at the paper. I don't think we want to spend more time on this here. But again, the person who is asking isn't missing anything. They're making a connection.
Okay, cool.
All right. Okay. And then the next one I think we addressed. Can you phrase the difference between argument and warrant? Is there anything, do you think there's anything we should revisit there?
No, the argument is the entire process, and the warrant is
Yes.
one part of argument. The part of argument that often gets, we wouldn't have written the paper if people were very comfortable using and explicating warrants. So that's yeah. So we've talked a lot about this, but that's
Exactly.
question.
Yeah.
Also,
Yeah, but it's
confusion often is that people confuse between an argument and a claim. Kind of the outcome of the argumentation process and the entire process. So that's also, I think it's a helpful. I'm not saying that people should necessarily use this language. It's Toolman's language, but it's important to understand that sort of what is being said and how what is being said is justified. Those are two different things.
Exactly. So if I talk to a doctoral student who is not my own advisee, I may ask them, what is your key argument? Usually what they give me is a claim, not an argument. Yeah. And then so should we use this, one of the questions is, should we start, this is further down the list, but should we use these terms, warrant, ground backing? It's not necessary, but I think it would be useful. And I think, I don't know if you would agree, but one of the reasons we have written this article is that we think that it would be useful to adopt this terminology.
Yeah, so it could, be helpful, but, this isn't about using specific words. If you understand the idea, it's entirely possible and likely actually that you'll be able to do it by using, complementary terms.
Yeah, but, yeah. I don't know.
This is our story and we stick with it.
This is our story, this is our choice, and we found this to be useful. I don't even know if there are probably many other treatments of argument structure, but this is the one.
Well, go back to Plato, sort of the notion of sort of knowledge as justified true belief, which is, Plato actually didn't quite say that, but that's the classical tripartite definition of knowledge that's attributed to him. I think it's in the dialogue Theaetetos, however you pronounce the Greek name, but sort of there's a dialogue between several characters, and they come up with a definition that looks pretty much like this, and the justified aspect. So truth perhaps it has a less traction these days than it has had sort of for the philosophers before Christ, but still the notion of justification, that you truly believe something and you're expressing that belief and you're justifying it somehow. So that's another way, basically saying what Toolman is saying.
Exactly, and one of the punchlines is that the answer to justification is never because the data told me so. Because it was in the data. All this stuff, science is all about numbers and all this. This is all an overly romanticized view of science. The idea that knowledge is embedded in data. To me, it's just, it's a preposterous claim to me that knowledge would be embedded in data, and your task is to mine it. Your task is to mine the knowledge from data. I just don't, I think it's just...
Looking back on Plato again, sort of, the notion of belief, and a belief is an sort of inherently social and human, that we share beliefs and we entertain beliefs, and sort of, data don't believe, and sort of, it's the difference between knowledge and data it's pretty fundamental.
Yeah, this notion that there is no knowledge without the knower.
Yeah. And the knower in some cases can arguably be a community, community nowadays. So it doesn't have to necessarily be an individual. And there are ways to even sort of, our colleagues who work on knowledge communities and so on. So they have looked at that in empirical research and so on.
Yeah. And this, okay, let's see. Next one. Okay, the next one is actually about rejecting a warrant in, let's say in peer review, you want to use a warrant and that warrant gets rejected. Can I just ask you, what would you do, or what have you done in a situation where you realize that, you know, I think the beef here is that my warrant has been rejected?
Yeah, so my experience has been sort of with qualitative research that if you're really so this is a thorny question. So sometimes I feel that that kind of really discussing alternatives to the warrant that I'm presenting. So it might actually be a bit risky because some reviewers um, take it as a sign of a lack of confidence, which I think is really regrettable. That sort of whenever you're entertaining alternative ways. For instance, David Boji in his 95 paper on the Disney, which we used you and I, we used it in an earlier AMR as an
Yeah.
example. He actually talks about he adopts a certain type of deconstruction as his interpretive device, and sort of he actually debates that there could have been other ways of looking at deconstruction, and for these reasons I selected this one. I think that's actually it's a great example of a very strong reasoning in and justification of a warrant, that he actually looks at alternatives. But I often actually have to be honest, I don't do that myself without being pushed, because sometimes you get punished for doing that. So I kind of just leave it to myself. So I do that type of, and my co-authors, and we debate the method, and then just justify whatever tool, the single tool. But that actually sort of that is a weak form of inference rather than a strong form of inference. So I would say that if it's rejected, the obvious, and you still are allowed to play that, they give you a revision and you have to then respond.
Yeah.
So the obvious way, we talked about this yesterday actually, sort of, and you noted it, that sort of then you open up the reasoning process, and you hope that sort of the reviewers and the editor, they actually understand that inference gets stronger when you're looking at alternatives and you're selecting between, sort of course you end up actually sometimes even sort of doing extra rounds of analyses, collecting new data, doing different kinds of framings if the theoretical framing doesn't work, and that happens in the review process, especially with qualitative papers. So there's significant rewriting. So if it's rejected, then the first question, well, is it for a pretty good reason? Rejected? And then can I? But I fall back on, there have been instances where really sort of an early revision has been founded on a single sentence in the editorial letter that me and my co-authors, we really felt that, okay, now editor here actually captures what the problem in the manuscript is. And then we actually use that as a guideline, and then almost, of course we read the letter, but we don't, do a checklist that we're going to sort of do everything, but really kind of so it's our job to get to the bottom of, so why is it that this rejection is happening? And it's often not voiced very well. So, because reviewers and editors, they're also human beings, and they don't have the benefit of understanding your empirical context as well as you do. And so this has to be understood as well, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it starts with, because this person is asking, an editor rejected a paper because they did not accept the warrant. Well, first of all, the first agreement that we have to come to is that it was indeed a warrant that was rejected. Okay, so I think that maybe our paper and Toulmin's work and the framework and the concepts, first of all, they give us a vocabulary to talk about what is it that we disagree on. Do we disagree? Is the disagreement on the grounds, on the claim, on the warrants, or on their backings? Okay, and if the disagreement is on the warrants, then we can say, okay, well, we know that warrants are in some sense a matter of choice. So let me try to make my choice as author as transparent as I can. And please, reviewer, make your reasoning as to why you want to reject that choice as transparent as possible. So let's look at the bankings as well. This reminds me of one of my early articles that I wrote with my dissertation advisor on the adoption of innovative manufacturing practices. And one of the arguments we made that there could be institutional kind of mimicry mechanisms at play. And that was a really hard sell at JOM. Because the received view or the theorizing, this was early 2000s, so about 16 years ago.
Institutional theory hadn't yet contaminated your little pond. Yeah.
Exactly. So I remember that we really struggled with Roger to get that thing published. But now it's coming back to me that we really had to go. We had to establish institutional theory as a warrant, which meant that we had to look at the backings as well, and we tried to convince the reviewers and the editors that, okay, this is novel to operations management, but at the same time, in the general management literature, in sociology, this is a really established warrant that has a solid backing. So that was but that was one of those instances when one of the reviewers said, I just don't buy this. I don't buy the idea that a manufacturing plant would implement JIT, whether it made strategic sense or not, simply because, some really well-known famous company had done it. Think of the emulation of the Toyota production system. I'm absolutely convinced that that taking the institutional lens, Meyer and Rowe and DiMaggio and Powell is useful and can lead to credible claims and arguments about why a factory adopts certain practices and not others. But this was all about, battling warrants, I think.
Yeah. Well, sometimes rationality is socially constructed, and sort of, that might be a hard pill to swallow. If you're very a hardcore, rationalist in believing how managers make decisions. But anyway, so that is, but it's sort of to generalize from this, and this relates to the 2017 paper that you and I and Jupp Kornelsen wrote about, kind of theory development and research programs. That what you were doing is that you were looking for a warrant outside your sort of research program and sort of from another one, which obviously for me, because I'm very cushy with sort of sociological thinking, for me that's kind of self-evident that sort of managers are not rational, and the rationality is actually something that you construct, and it's driven by institutional. So it wouldn't be at all surprising to me, but sort of it's a hard road to take.
Absolutely.
And sort of sometimes life isn't fair.
And
anyway, let's move forward. This
is
cool.
So let's see. Next one is about teaching. You want to tackle this one? So
we talked about this. So let me just
So let's read the question. So should we make changes to how we teach doctoral students based on what we argue in our paper?
Yeah. So the way that I would see this is that so there's the sort of a tendency to, especially what I see in North America, which I've been here for now more than 6 years, but my previous life was in Europe, and I think that's so there's a stronger emphasis, even though doctoral students here are extremely well trained compared to Europe often, but there is a stronger expectation of compliance that I see around me. So we're kind of making doctoral students jump through all sorts of hoops, and sometimes that's very helpful if the hoops are of the right kind. But there's a risk that we're expecting doctoral students to comply with all sorts of rules of thumb, which might not be very justified, or at least the justification is very implicit that so I would say that the bottom line is that we need to find ways to like you said with the tennis example yesterday, that if you go to a tennis teacher, so you can't expect the tennis teacher to guarantee that you'll learn to play tennis. It's you has to kind of learn the practice of doing the work. So science is a practice, and that practice is embedded in your capacity to reason. And sort of I'm reminded of a French philosopher, Gilles Deleuze, who says that sort of those who more or less, so I'm paraphrasing, but sort of those who who say do as I do, they really teach us very little. Our true teachers are those who say do with me, and sort of
Okay.
to join
Yeah.
me in this practice. And so that's what I try to do with my PhD students. So whenever they ask me what should I do, I always tell them that you should do the right thing. It's just that you should understand very well why that's the right thing
But
for
yeah.
you. Do
Yeah.
that, and for that you sort of understand the tradition of qualitative research that you're doing, and so on. And
Yeah.
for quant research, and I'm not an expert, I'm sure that I know that you're an extremely good teacher of stats. I've seen you in action. But sort of for me, it seems that also the way that we teach statistics should be founded on helping students truly understand what the devices are, even though they're difficult and they're
Yeah.
complex
Yeah.
and
And
abstract.
and and unfortunately, that's not how we teach.
Yeah,
We teach that you run the Houseman test, and if it gives you a significant result, you go with fixed effects. Um, and then that's what we teach in econometrics.
yeah,
But that rule, first of all, Houseman never prescribed that. So it's an urban legend. And there are so many urban legends that survive even after they have been established as being pseudo methodological. We still use it. So they're kind of like the cockroach. You try to flush them, they keep coming back. So it's really, but I think even a better example than tennis is both you and I have taken voice lessons.
sure, yeah,
So that's even a better example because you really have to figure out how to use your lungs. You really
yeah,
have to figure out because that's the most intimate instrument there is. So
yeah,
again, if you go to take voice lessons and you assume that now the teacher is going to make you a good singer, you will be thoroughly disappointed.
yeah,
From the first moment, you have to start figuring things out yourself. What works for you, what doesn't work for you, because you're using your body as an instrument. So I think that's even a better example than learning to play tennis. Although I would argue that it's the same thing with just about any skill. You need to figure things out instead of assuming that, oh, if I can only adopt the blueprint, I'll be fine.
mm,
But many doctoral students come to class thinking that they will be given the blueprint.
yeah. That
Yeah,
happens, and it's
yeah,
anxiety. It's understandable, and
yeah,
it's sort of we have to work with junior colleagues to kind of educate them in the practice that we know and love. So that's the thing. So when a PhD student comes to me and says, "How many interviews do I need to do to finish my PhD?"
yeah,
without even saying what they want to study, then I have my work cut out for me. That
yeah,
we
yeah,
have to then start kind of figuring out how to reason and yeah. So there are it goes to the practice of teaching, but I think that just to sum up, I think that the key understanding is that we shouldn't teach our PhD students to be compliant.
yeah.
Rather, we
This
should teach them
exactly.
the practice of reasoning as well as we can.
Yeah,
And
this is
this
not
proof of
about
practice.
compliance.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, next question should the terms warrant ground backing qualifiers start to appear in manuscripts? Um, why not? Not
yeah,
necessary, but I think they're useful.
yeah,
And I think that useful terms should be used. So I have found them useful. I have found them useful. Um, I'll probably use them more in future manuscripts. I certainly use them in the classroom. I use them in conversation. But I think time will tell. Time
mm,
will tell how useful this terminology is going to be. So I think our paper is kind of an invitation to a conversation. Let's
yeah,
try this out and see what happens.
yeah. So it's definitely,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I'm convinced that we'll be able to tackle some of the questions that seem elusive to us with more systematicity
mm,
if we adopt this. Just like if you look at how Davis wrote about what's interesting,
mm,
or how Locke and Goldenbill wrote about contributions. They
yeah,
offered systematic ways of thinking and talking about them. I think we're talking about the same thing with the Toolman. model.
Yeah, so and this is something that my good friend and colleague Jeff Lowenstein from the University of Illinois at the Urbana campaign, so that's he talks about vocabularies,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
the power of vocabularies for us to understand each other. So you have a couple of surgeons, who don't speak the same language, even they're from different countries and they end up operating on somebody's appendix. They know how to operate.
yeah.
You can expect them to be pretty efficient because they just the Latin and the basic practices, the vocabularies, and how they attach to the way that they practice their work, so they're pretty universal. So that's one example, and there are sort of having some vocabulary to build on, as long as that vocabulary doesn't become a crutch or a cage, so
Exactly.
so we're productive in using it.
Yeah, very good.
I think the next question will make your heart sing. I think this
So,
is
okay,
something that I want to talk
okay.
about. Going from a theory-based conceptual model to structural equation model to empirical testing, is the conceptual model a warrant?
Okay, this is an interesting question, and you and I are working on a paper
I know.
that looks at the use of models.
Yeah.
So let's say you have a conceptual or a theoretical model. Let's say the theoretical model is structural contingency theory or transaction cost economics. Let's take the Walker and Weber study, 1984. They have a structural equation model of the make or buy decision, and then that's couched in transaction cost economics. Now, it's really interesting. What is the relationship between the theoretical, let's call it a theoretical model, and the empirical model? The SCM model is an empirical model. Is the conceptual model a warrant? I don't think it's a warrant. This is something that we really need to think through. The relationship between the theoretical model and the empirical model, I could even see that it's actually the structural equation model that becomes a warrant.
Okay. So Mikko, how about this? So let's play a little game. I don't know the Walker and Weber paper, but sort of this is something that we've been talking about a lot. That a part of the the challenge with model-based research is, again, sort of warrants are missing. But for instance, we have a sort of theory which is basically configuration-based. So we have a theory which is predicting certain phenomena because of combinations of things, like the configuration theory in strategy is one thing, but there's also, and that's where we have something in theory, the structure of which is not causal. And then often, there's a translation of a theoretical model to an empirical model, which then sort of looks like something that is causal. And then that translation is not warranted. So you're actually missing a warrant for doing that. And actually you're doing violence to the theoretical argument by sort of imposing a causal aspect.
That's true.
So I think that could be one example that is not, so the warrant really is then just conventional, and it's actually doing damage rather than sort of you're not testing what you're supposed to be testing.
That's true. I think it's a problem. I think it's a problem because TCE is an equilibrium model. Yep. It's based on the foundational theoretical idea is something called discriminating alignment. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so if you thought that in TCE, in the theory, the make or buy decision is the dependent variable, that's incorrect. There are no dependent variables in TCE. It's an equilibrium. So you take the different aspects of the transaction and the governance of the transaction, and you find an alignment of those elements. But alignment is about fit. So when you go to the store to buy shoes, you buy shoes that fit your feet. But your foot isn't causing the shoe size in any way. It's not a causal argument. So here, and this is something we need to really go into detail in our paper that we're working on the use of models, is to make sure that the link between the theoretical model and the empirical model is methodologically credible. So I think warrants do play a role in that, but I don't think of neither the conceptual model nor the empirical model, I don't think they should be necessarily be thought of as warrants, although we will use different kinds of warrants in that setting as well. So this is an excellent question, but we can't do justice to it here, because I find that even my own thinking is a kind of half-baked here. But if we promise this person that we will address this question in our future paper.
Yeah, so that's good. So, for me, I think that in a nutshell, the issue is that often where you need a warrant is when you're translating something theoretical to something empirical.
Exactly, it's a translation.
Yeah, so that translation processes require warrants. So, in that sense, I would say that the answer to this question is no. So you would actually need a warrant to do what is suggested here.
You need a warrant to go from the theoretical model to the SCM. That's I think the short. Okay, the next one is clearly then for you. So similar to the way we now see the JOM method being quite standard practice with standard key figures, do you have a standard visuals for presenting these ideas? For example, the way you did when showing the competing claims, warrants and backings in the Schwinn case. So let's talk about, so what are the standard practices with the JOM methodology? What kinds of diagrams do we see?
So, in the JOM methodology, what he does with the diagrams and why it's so popular, I think, and for a very good reason, is that sort of he has a data structure figure typically, which allows him to, and his co-authors to plot in a lot of empirical examples of his concepts, the concepts and constructs that he uses in his model that then follows. And so he shows not, he's never claimed that this is an purely inductive process where these things emerge, but it's a way of presenting his data. And then sort of the beautiful aspect of that presentation is that then he can take those exact concepts, often what he calls the second or the third order aggregate concepts and theoretical concepts, and then sort of presents them in a model, typically some kind of a process model. I think the challenge there often sort of, is that it kind of predisposes you not to look at the relationships as much as the concepts themselves. So
exactly.
And sort of often there is nothing in the data structure that actually suggests that there's a certain order in which this should be presented. But there are counter examples. For instance, the paper that he wrote with Rajiv Nag in AMJ, I think it was 2007. So there you see some of that as well, but sort of it's a much sort of less elegant and more complex challenge when you have to actually sort of plot out the relationships into a data structure as well. So, but I think there are very, so it doesn't do everything, but it does certain things very well, and sort of it's certainly a step forward. You just have to understand that the more processual you get in your story, and the more it's about relationships, the less elegant it will be to use those visualizations normally. So if you're really focused on why is it in the model I'm seeing sort of this order of things or sort of these relationships, it's harder to do with a data structure, which tends to be conceived of in terms of the concepts, the boxes rather than the arrows or the order of the arrows, if you will. But I think sort of the picture that we have there, this is this is basically adopted from Toulmin. So Toulmin, if you read Toulmin's books, you can get a pretty sort of good idea of sometimes pretty elaborate ways of presenting the argumentation process. And sort of he also incorporates sort of rebuttals and sort of more complex aspects of the argument, not just warrants and backings and grounds and claims, but sort of rebuttals and limitations, or what's the final one? Sorry, it's not limitations, but what's the final? Rebuttals and, help me out in here. You have a better memory.
For what?
For the 6 things in the Toulmin model. So you have
warrants, grounds claims, warrants, backings, qualifiers. So qualifiers are the underlined words here. So the antitrust argument was that evidently Schwinn used coercion. The efficiency argument is that plausibly Schwinn sought to improve efficiency.
Yeah.
So these are qualifiers, and qualifiers are important. We write about qualifiers in our paper more. We didn't talk about this much. And then the final sixth element is rebuttal. And we could actually think of the efficiency argument as a rebuttal of the antitrust argument. And then one of the questions is the efficiency argument a credible rebuttal of the antitrust argument? All right, so those are the six elements. And could someone use something like this in an actual empirical article to their advantage? Yeah, I think they could.
Absolutely. If you want to sort of, go beyond, if the author wants to go beyond our visualizations, go back to the later of the two Toulmin books and sort of, there's actually, he uses these visualizations and there are alternatives that you can work with.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that. I have seen Toulmin used in our field. So there are, for instance, Derek Harmon published an ASQ paper, a couple of years ago where he did just that, and there are, we do, but I haven't seen that visualization used in the field. It would actually be pretty novel by looking into that.
And by the way, all the content here comes from Williamson. These are not my ideas. These are not our ideas. These are not Toulmin's ideas. Toulmin provides the framework, but I had to assemble these boxes, the contents from 3 different books and about a dozen different articles that Williamson has written. And now if I'm thinking about this, what if Williamson had adopted Toulmin's framework very early on and presented, hey, this is what I'm talking about? I think that he would have been able to make his point much more eloquently and much more effectively if he had said, I'm going to use something called a Toulmin framework here, and I'm going to present a rebuttal of what I call the antitrust argument, and I'm going to show you why I disagree with the Supreme Court's ruling, and so on. So I think that seeing something like this in an empirical article, or maybe in an appendix, or maybe as part of a response to reviews in a review process, I mean, why not? Why not? Anything
I'd be blown away, quite honestly, if I would see that sort of,
Yeah, I'd love to see this myself as a,
structure. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Let's see, next one. How to be more explicit when writing research output. So this is writing articles, I assume, or dissertations. Including all justifications about authors' decisions. Yeah, may increase the number of words and maybe an issue, but can we add that as a supplementary document, add a cover letter to the editor? I think a lot of this actually happens behind the scenes. It happens in the review processes, in the conversations, in response to reviews, in letters to the editor. So maybe we won't see as much in the final outputs. Maybe we'll see more in terms of, hey, when we negotiate with our audience, when we negotiate with the peer reviewers as to, is this credible or not? Is this transparent or not? So
yeah, you have to prioritize, obviously, sort of as well. I think in all the journals that I know of, there is the practice of a response letter that is not only a possibility, but it's an expectation of them, that sort of response letters tend to be long and elaborate. There's no space constraints for those, so you can be as elaborate as you want. But the prioritization is key. So you need to understand what is your core arguments,
Yeah, exactly.
And then what are the warrants for those, and so what do you, because if you start piling them up, obviously there will be a point when it becomes confusing. But I think in real life practice, this really isn't the problem. So people don't warrant their claims too much.
Yeah, I don't think that's not a problem.
See any.
That's not a problem. Yeah. So so our message is not that manuscripts need to be made longer.
Okay.
That's not what we're saying. Yeah.
No,
All right.
but in you need to understand what your core argument is and sort of then make sure that you warranted that.
Yeah, exactly.
What is your thought on a study that uses transaction data from one company? This has been controversial and relates to the statistical generalizability versus analytical generalizability. All right, so do you want to do this?
Okay, so using transaction data from I have nothing against it. I have used it many times myself.
Mhm.
But we kind of touched upon this. Every study, like I said, if you study Honda's supply chain, your claims can't be about Honda's supply chain.
Mm.
Okay, there has to be a sense of generality, but not statistical generalizability, but some sense of generality. Why should someone who doesn't give two hoots about Honda or Honda's supply chain, why should they care? I think it's possible to establish this sense of generality, even if you have studied just one company. But I think that you need to think about the structure of the argument here.
Yeah, and
Right?
qualifiers and rebuttals, are obviously very relevant if you're looking at a single case, and the difference that the the person who asked the question, it's an apt distinction between statistical and analytical generalizability. I think analytical generalizability goes back to Yin. It might be even another, but Yin was in his case study book, sort of he was famous for using that. And the idea is that you're generalizing to theory rather than to a population, and that's what you have to do at some point anyway. Even if you have a really large scale,
Yeah.
multiple case or a statistical study, you're even though you're generalizing to a population, that often a population isn't that interesting.
Exactly. Yeah, this is what people don't understand.
Yeah.
People need to understand this about statistical research.
Mm.
Yes, we make inferences from the sample to the population, but nobody's interested in your population.
Mm.
Nobody is interested in your population. All right.
Except
So,
and in the types of sort of blue chip journals that we tend to think about. So then there are obviously, journals that might be interested in, say, hospitality management or sports management, and they might sort of, find just statistical generalities in a particular population interesting, and that's a different thing. But sort of,
that's
you
it.
can't.
Yeah, no, I agree. Industry studies are a different thing, but often a statistical sample does not represent an industry. Okay, it often represents multiple industries, or it represents industries that are defined by the woefully outdated SIC codes. Okay, so just like Fisher said back in the day, most populations in statistics are just figments of imagination.
Yep. So the
And
notion of
yeah,
analytical generality is sort of, it's kind of relevant almost everywhere. It's not just that if you do a single case study, then you have to work, you have to contribute something to theory. You have to do that anyway. So
yeah, we all have to. We all have to do that.
Yeah.
All right,
All
very
right.
good.
Good question.
Yeah, these are really good. Okay, next one. This is good. How would you judge which warrant is more valid as a so let's say that you're a reviewer and you are facing a kind of situation where you can identify multiple warrants. How do you what do you do in that situation as
Okay,
a
first of
reviewer?
all, as a reviewer, I'm already impressed and happy that I can identify several warrants. So going
Yeah.
back to my checklist, that if I can understand what the claim is, in the papers already, sort of I'm feeling happy for the authors. If I see warrants, some justification of those claims, I'm pretty happy at that point. So this is the third question. So do I then and say that and again, sort of going back to your example about the traveling nurses, so it's I have to understand something about the empirical context and the research problem that's being asked, and the authors have to help me if I don't know that. We talk about sort of contextual types of warrants where actually you'll have some pre-knowledge, and but sort of often that's not the case. So that's one thing, that sort of, do I actually have enough to understand the backing of the warrant. If I'm seeing a warrant just glibly, then in qualitative research, people cite Eisenhardt and Joy, and then that's it, or Glaser and Strauss and Corbin, Sharma's, these types of authorities, and the type of warrant is that this is what they say that I should do, and
Yeah,
and sort of I just did what they told me to do, so that there's no backing for the warrant. So then
precisely.
so that's
Precisely.
not very valid if I would use that word. So I don't think that's a strong type of warrant. If it's just kind of again compliance, it's not going back to the Feuerabend idea that sort of anything goes, but sort of is this the correct method for what you want to establish? So
Yeah,
I would
no.
look into those, going back to the checklist. So congratulations if you've already done the first two, that I am seeing some warrants. And then the third one is that sort of, are they backed up by what you want to do?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, somebody says, I'm doing a multiple case study and I have 6 cases and then cite Eisenhardt 1989. Okay. That's a warrant, but it's a bad warrant because
Mhm.
what's the backing? What is the backing for the, with the production location paper, we had 35 cases. Okay.
Yeah.
And we had a reason for that. And we had to, in the review process, we had to justify that.
Yeah.
I think one of the reviewers asked, this is a large number of cases. And we said, yeah. But these rules of thumb, or, 0.7 for Cronbach's alpha or 10 for variance inflation factor, these are warrants that we use. But once we look at their backings, we find nothing. Okay, so we need to be able to separate. There are good warrants and bad warrants. Things get interesting when you have 2 good warrants that are competing. What do we do? What do we do in that situation when we have 2? This actually could relate to the next question. Why don't we bring the next question?
Yeah, sure.
So this is about the production location. You chose to use the warrant, the cost minimization aspect, and the structural aspect. If a reviewer did not agree with you and indicated you failed to consider other important factors such as power, what would you do? Okay, so this is a perfect challenge. So,
Okay.
so we know that we have different ways of looking at supply chains. We can look at them from a process perspective. We can look at them from a geography perspective, from a time-based perspective, and we can look at them from a structural or cost perspective. Okay, so we chose in choosing formalization, coupling, and specificity as the 3 key foundational a priori concepts, we implicitly chose a cost minimization and structural approach. Okay. Interestingly enough, we weren't challenged with that choice. I think maybe one of the reasons was that we made that choice fairly explicit. We said we choose these we did not argue that those 3 concepts emerge from the data. Okay, if we had said that, and I hope it's not, and I don't think we said that, we said these are a priori adopted. And in communicating that, we communicated to the reader that we chose these. Why did we choose them? We chose them because they have received less attention than kind of the conventional, location-based advantages and time-based competition, things like that. So we said we chose these because they represent a view that has received less attention. And that seemed to convince the reviewers.
Yeah, I'm actually sort of reminded about, so this is in a sense pretty profound question, and there are profound misunderstandings often. And sort of I can think of both issues in qualitative and quantitative research. So beginning with qualitative research, people often feel that their job as scholars is to explain what happens in their case. And
Okay. Yeah.
isn't what they're supposed to be doing. So that's both, the bar is both too low and too high at the same time. If you're expecting to do that, it's too low because nobody is interested in your case.
It's just the case. True.
Sort of, I'm not, as a reader, I'm not interested in a UK, NHS middle manager somewhere and sort of,
Yeah.
why they did what they did. Sort of, I couldn't care less, honestly, if I'm being blunt here. So the bar
Yeah.
is way too low. It's way too high because, there's always so many things that can explain what sort of happens in a case. And sort of that's not going to be, in any way, theoretically interesting if you try to cram everything in. And there's different,
Yeah.
even to the extent that different research programs, they can, bring in alternative explanations. So you have to actually limit and focus your study and sort of, it's your job then to use the case, what you see in the case, to contribute to theory. So, what is it that what happens, some aspect of what happens in my case actually sort of shows us something new.
Yeah.
For instance, Rene Wiedner and I, we had a paper in the ASQ a couple of years ago about organizational separations. And sort of, our finding was that you actually have to communicate more in the process of separating rather than trying to define autonomy and demonstrate autonomy and grow into autonomy. Actually, autonomy is built through a much closer interaction in the early part of the separation. And sort of we have a process model of what happens, and actually a positive and negative dynamic in different models. But the thing there is that sure, there's all, say, an identity explanation could, we actually had to, because we had an identity reviewer was pushing back and saying that, identity scholars have already said what you say. So we actually had to do a very surgically precise reading of the identity literature and demonstrate that not only did we not find very strong evidence of identity in the separation situation, but also that sort of, the reviewer, wasn't justified in claiming that this dynamic had been captured by the identity
Yeah.
literature.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if we had crammed in identity, we could have had a more complex model. But it was an NHS case in the UK in a particular city. Who cares? If you're
Well,
a reader in Singapore, sort of, why would you care about the reader of ASQ? Why would you care about the NHS? So
no,
that's
no,
one thing.
no.
The other thing from quant studies, which you have taught me as a very young doctoral student, that sort of, no statistical study, no HD study really sort of explains, or predicts a large chunk of the variance that you're going to see. So
No.
it's, it's like, I think this is kind of crucial here, is that there's always, alternative explanations. But
Yeah.
if you see several strong warrants being discussed in a paper, so I'm very happy if I see a paper like that. So you have a very positive problem if you're sort of able to choose between several sort of well-backed warrants. So
Yeah.
then I sort of, then I know that I'm dealing with serious professionals if I see that in a paper that I'm reviewing.
Yeah. Okay, this reminds me of we talked about truth and the big T word yesterday. So I think this might be a good time to revisit that.
Perfect.
Let's look at the Schwinn. Let's look at the claims.
Mm-hmm.
I would argue that it's silly to ask whether this claim is true or not. Why? Because, first of all, it assumes that there's only one reason for the decision that Schwinn made. But this is not true. Why do you live in Montreal? Give me the one reason why you live in Montreal. Give me the one reason you have the number of children you have. Give me the one. So it's silly to think in terms of every decision has to have that one explanation. And then when we have that, we will have this. This isn't the point. Okay. I don't know what all the drivers behind Schwinn's decisions were. The people who made those decisions are long dead. We can never get the full picture. And even if we did, nobody would care. Nobody would.
And even if you had a time machine, the people themselves wouldn't know. So that's if you study cognition, you understand anything about sort of cognitive science, you realize that sort of, say, interviewing people isn't necessarily the best way to understand how they make decisions.
Exactly. So therefore,
one aspect, so even the decision makers don't have perfect access to answer, the truth. So the notion of truth here is kind of silly.
It is silly. It is irrelevant. It is irrelevant because and finally, but this, when we come to the research program of transaction cost economics, this is one of the stories that's told in TCE, but this claim is not of interest to anyone. Okay, the claim that is of interest is this one. Transactions supported by specific asset specificity is the most important concept in transaction cost, that Williamson's formulation. This is the thing, and this has the sense of generality that you need to look for. I mean, we would not hear this story unless Williamson had written about it and given it a broader theoretical interpretation. But we use it in our paper because I think it's a wonderful example of argument structure, competing warrants, and understanding why we agree or disagree. So that's why we use it. But again, no one's interested in Schwen as such. All right. Let's see. So yeah, I agree that, you know, if you face a situation where you believe that your warrant is being rejected unfairly, be open about it. Be open about it in your response. Be open about it too. And this is, of course, where not only the reviewers, but the associate editors and editors in chief have to be awake. They need to understand. So they need to understand. But I think that if we make things more transparent, and if those who are involved in the debate agree that, yeah, this is a question of warrants, I think we will have made a lot of headway into having an intelligent conversation instead of just a peeing contest at that point. And understand that these are choices. Just like I am choosing cost minimization, the power researcher is choosing the power perspective. So if we realize that, then I think that will bring a sense of humility to the conversation, because we realize that we're talking about choice and not about inevitability. All right? Very good.
Okay. This is starting to resemble a Vladimir Putin type of a television broadcast. I think we've been at it for more than an hour already, and we've kind of we've done like 1/3 of the questions. So we
well, let's keep going. Let's at least cover all the ones that have been upvoted. So I think we're going down the list here. So we got plenty to go. But let's see when we run out of gas, and then we'll stop. So next one is under determination. So you want to tackle this one?
So isn't determinism under determination related to the variations of why we have theories, as the goal of theories is to be reductionist rather under determinism being an outcome of a theory? If so, does it boil down to explaining Williamson that his theory can and cannot explain by making warrants in a paper that employs TC? So I think, you know, what I'm getting from this question is actually what we just talked about, that that sort of, you know, theories are helpful ways for us to think about organizations in sort of the case of organization theory. So that's what they do. Or in the case of economics, of sort of economic transactions, economic activity, you know, so they are sort of heuristic devices ultimately that allow us to think more broadly about the phenomena that we study, but they are not, you know, this is perfectly related to the question of truth. So theories aren't true. Even sort of, we have sometimes, you know, we tend to have physics envy, that we think that in physics, you know, at least theories that are true, and actually sort of, you know, we talked about this, but sort of, you know, contemporary theories of physics are kind of esoteric and interesting and wild. And sort of, I think you'd be hard pressed to say that all of them are true. You know, there are 17 dimensions with sort of strings vibrating and sort of stuff, alternative universes and stuff. So, you know, some of the stuff, you know, it's pretty wild, but they're arguably helpful heuristics for sort of trying to grapple with the universe, but sort of, you know, they're no more true arguably than our theory.
Although our theories aren't heuristics, our theories are ways of making sense, ways of explaining, ways of interpreting. And I think that, to me, the key reason for underdetermination is because we use theoretical concepts. We talk about focused factories, we talk about strategy and innovation, and what would happen if we banned the use of theoretical terms from our lexicon and from our conversations, and we could only speak in terms of empirical concepts? I think life would be, first of all, very different.
that goes to basically to, that's why logical positivism failed.
Precisely.
Way to do that.
Precisely.
At least sort of if theoretical concepts are based on unobservables.
Exactly.
That figured out by Otto Neurath and Rudolf Carnap and this group of philosophers before the Second World War already. So there's actually no way of doing that, and sort of also in sort of human beings wouldn't be able to operate if we didn't have some sort of theories in action in how we go about our lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay. The next one's interesting. Don't warrants risk to be subjective and depending on the researcher background? Will multidisciplinary become a must-have to see things from multiple perspectives?
I like that question. Do you mind if I take a stab?
Take a stab, and then I'll piggyback.
Okay, so and this goes back to our earlier work on sort of intersubjectivity versus objectivity. So at best, sort of we have scholarly communities that sort of share an understanding of something, some ground rule, some principle, and that could be called intersubjective. But there is, the word objective, it kind of riles me up a little bit. I'm not sure that we see a lot of that, and sort of how would we define objectivity? But sort of it's also very important to understand that sort of this does not imply a cynical form of relativism.
No, not at all.
I think that's a misconception that even though there are no sort of a priori transcendental rules given to us by a benevolent deity to that if you do this then you're being objective, it doesn't mean that we can't be serious and that our theories can't be or predictions can't be stronger or weaker. We see that all the time. So that reliance on objectivity, it strikes me as kind of semi-religious almost in some cases, that you're trying to deal with your anxiety and doubt by sort of appealing to a higher power.
Yeah.
But the second part of the question actually is very interesting. That sort of should we actually have a multidisciplinary conversation? It's funny enough. So we've just had a paper conditionally accepted with a bunch of McGill colleagues here. To the AMR about open theorizing. And we're actually making this argument, and it's also related to the argument that Martin Korbegger and I we made in our thought experiments paper that Suzanne mentioned yesterday, which is that actually the theory crisis that we're seeing. So there's this argument that the field has become both sort of kind of almost like fetishistic about methods and sort of certain sort of empirical principles that we kind of adhere to, and on the other hand, the theories have become rigid and abstract and non-relevant. And I do think that sort of even these seemingly frustrating policy debates that we have different, you have OB people and OT people and operations people coming to an academy, Academy of Management panel where they share nothing in terms of research program. But sort of still that's kind of useful because they even though it can be frustrating and sort of and really bland and just sometimes it can end up to no discussion. There's also a potential that we're really kind of shedding a light on that, hey, there's actually this thing that's happening now in organizations. So I think COVID is a great example. So we're seeing organizational practices being sort of severely disrupted, new ones emerging. And sort of our theories really haven't had the time to pick up. So having these kinds of uncomfortable cross-theory program or research program debates, it can actually be very helpful for the rejuvenation of theory. So I think that the questioner here has is onto something that I would.
You're absolutely. So we did mention this. So let's again look at the Schwinn arguments here. Is there subjectivity here? Well, I don't know. Certainly researcher background. So Oliver Williamson is trained in economics. Okay, so of course this is about backgrounds. And then if you look at the Supreme Court, if you look at the members there who make decisions, we know they have legal training, so we can look at people's backgrounds. And of course, I think it was Jay Barney who said that all academic work is autobiographical. I mean, it's true. Why did we choose structural contingency theory and TCE as the warrants in the production location paper? I think, I'm guilty. I'm guilty because I am trained in those. So, but is this about subjectivity? Well, let's look at these arguments here. There's really no subjectivity in the sense that we understand. We see that we have different kinds of premises, but these premises aren't just any premises. They're paradigmatic premises. They're established premises. So not anything goes here. So this is not about what I prefer. This is about what I can argue.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think the notion really is sort of, the intersubjectivity is kind of
Precisely, intersubjectivity.
And then the cool aspect about that question is that typically you see intersubjectivity play out at the level of a research program. So TCE people,
It's a research program, yeah.
Obviously they're somewhat embedded into each other. So organizational economics as a field is that they share certain premises, and they could be called a research program as well. But say organizational theorists, as who are often rooted in sociology, they actually sort of have a very different type of intersubjective understanding, which actually goes back to your example of your early paper with Roger Schroeder, where you wanted to kind of introduce a warrant from institutional theory, which is basically sociology, to operations management, which has a different kind of a intersubjective understanding. So I think that's an example that yes, so if we are able to come together and sort of also see these collisions between research programs, and this is, by the way, something that you and I talk a lot about in the paper with Job Cornelissen in AMR 2017. So I think that's potentially helpful. This is something that Paolo Leone and Samer Faraj and I, in the forthcoming AMR, we talk about. I hope that it is accepted, but it's conditionally accepted. We talk about cross-pollination, where sort of new topics, new ground is discovered in kind of a collision between different research programs. Yeah. So I think this is an excellent question.
Yeah, and these are two different programs. We could think of antitrust as a research program. It's a lot of that is couched in theories of industrial organization economics, IO economics, that often take an industry level analysis. Yeah. And these are two different research programs. I might even call them different paradigms, because they, we can have a conversation across. So these are not Kuhnian. Kuhnian paradigms are so far from one another that there is a collapse in communication, a breakdown in communication. But these two can communicate. They make different claims because they use different warrants. But these are, paradigmatic approaches to, and here's the punchline. Williamson did not argue that he is correct and the Supreme Court was incorrect. His point was this, and this goes to the point of objectivity, although I would call this impartiality instead of objectivity. Williamson argued that antitrust rulings are so consequential that we can't just pick one set of warrants and run with them. We have to carry out a balanced investigation. So he's not saying that it is evident that Schwinn sought to improve efficiency. But imagine this being a trial, and here's the plaintiff saying, oh, okay, the defendant has done really, really bad things. If the defense is able to argue plausibly they are doing something that is entirely benign, if they're able to convince the judge and or the jury of that, they will not be convicted, especially if it's a murder trial, where the bar is really high, beyond reasonable doubt. Well, if I can plausibly argue that the defendant is not guilty, I think I'm done. I think that's sufficient to acquit. So in that sense, objectivity should be, I think, replaced by two words: intersubjectivity and impartiality. then I think we're talking about the right things.
Yeah, as a qualitative researcher, I would also add the word reflexivity. That sort of the best way
Reflexive.
for us to kind of be reach towards impartiality is to be aware of what our potential biases are and sort of be critical of them. All right,
Okay.
so let's move on.
Okay, so next one. Oh, I like next one. If your argument is mainly about logic, why would this be an OM paper rather than one that features in a journal that talks about logic, philosophy of science?
Yeah, because we're trying to help. That's been, I think, the one characteristic about sort of the stream of research that you and I have been doing for 20 years now is to try to introduce notions, from beyond the scope of management studies and sort of, incorporate knowledge from philosophy and adjacent fields to help practitioners of our knowledge communities to do better work. So that's and actually, if you read a lot of papers in the AMR, I think that's very typical. It's a typical way of contributing to understanding in our field is to sort of really kind of broaden the horizon of of bench scientists. When both of you and I are bench scientists, but sort of we do work to broaden our own horizons and then sort of help others broaden their horizons as well. So I think
Yeah,
that's the justification for it.
yeah. So if we had submitted this to philosophy of science and it had gotten accepted, how many empirical researchers were graded?
Yeah,
Approximately none.
yeah,
So we want to take the message to the grassroots. I mean, obviously, one of the reasons it's an OM paper is because I am from operations management,
mm,
and you are my co-author in multiple papers, and we've talked about this.
mm,
Um, but of course, our paper isn't just about OM research.
mm,
It's more broadly about management research. I mean, the Schwinn example isn't OM, although we can kind of see the supply chain stuff
yeah,
there. But it's somebody might say, no, this is more about industrial organization. This is more about strategy. This is more about economics. Um, so the message isn't just about OM, but we wanted to, these kinds of big challenges, I think, are best tackled one village at a time, if you will.
mm,
That if we
yeah,
can start a conversation in one field, and I think that the OM community here has a nice opportunity to spearhead what could actually become an influential movement more broadly in management research. But big things have small beginnings,
yeah,
and these beginnings are often local, and we have to make sure that the message resonates sufficiently so that when you go to back to work Monday morning, you will actually take the message to your
absolutely.
practice.
We've been both reviewing papers for the AMR quite a bit, and AMR has kind of picked up the pace in publishing this type of meta-theoretical philosophical work. And I guess, I'm in the outgoing cohort of the review board. So I, spent 2 years reviewing a lot of the stuff that I got sent for a very good reason was sort of, papers where the philosophy of science was sort of, evoked in different ways. And I think the main, so if the question here implies that, hey, I want to write a paper like this, how do I do that? I think the main hurdle that I saw in a lot of those papers was that they were trying to write to a philosophy journal, that, they were just, they, the footwork in informing, you know, the type of bench scientist that you and I are, what do we do on a Monday morning? That was missing. So there was just a discussion of Feuerbach and or
Yeah,
some
yeah.
philosopher, and sort of then just the ending was that you should see that this is very relevant. Well, no, I shouldn't see that it's relevant. You should tell me exactly how it's relevant.
Yeah.
Not that I need necessarily a checklist, but sort of I need to see a translation of sort of what aspects of our practice does this really speak to, and sort of what would be some of the ways that I could think differently about my practice that this philosopher could help me do. So if you want to publish a paper like this in a management journal, then that's the missing piece in a lot of the work that I see.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I have a love-hate relationship with the philosophy of science literature. Uh, at the risk of oversimplification, I think there are two kinds of philosophers.
Mm.
Those who want to regulate science and those who want to understand it.
Mm.
I have no patience for the former. I have a lot of patience and admiration for the latter. So philosophers who take the practice of science seriously. Paul Feyerabend understood physics. Many physicists who knew him said that it was remarkable how much he knew about physics. But how many philosophers of science who wrote about physics, can get the same kind of admiration from the practicing scientists? So look at Popper and Hempel and others. They didn't do empirical research. It was very clear from their writings that they did not understand the practice of science, empirical research, but they were dealing with philosophical problems. How do we avoid the problem of induction? How should we reconstruct the methodology for testing hypotheses? But they knew very well that they were dealing not with the problems of the practicing scientist, but with philosophical problems. But then we have people like Toulmin and Peirce and Peter Lipton and others whose works have been an immense resource for me. But even they don't tell me how to do research, but they present me with challenges, with questions, with things. Hey, have you thought about this? Have you thought about the relationship between inference and explanation? Well, if you haven't, you should. That's Peter Lipton. His book, 2004 book, was an eye-opener for me, and that has produced, several articles that you and I have written. So that's and I don't know if I would have anything to say to philosophers of science. If we had sent this to, I don't even know if it would get accepted. Probably not.
Yeah, so
I
obviously
don't know.
sort of some of the things that we're saying, are not very new in that discourse.
No, exactly.
Established. However, sort of, I think there's a possibility of always kind of, having a dialogue on kind of demonstrating what, the science, the philosophical principles that philosophers come up with, how they actually resonate with empirical practice, and that can actually keep philosophers much more honest, as you described about Feyerabend, that he was deeply enmeshed in physics and sort of
Yeah,
wanted to
yeah,
understand that practice. That there's no doubt that it made his work better in certain ways. And I
yeah.
agree that sort of it depends on the philosophers. So there's they have their own sort of theory crises there, obviously, and we don't need to get into that perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. We're going on almost 2 hours here. Let's see.
Yeah.
Maybe let's take a couple more, and then if there is if now I'm speaking to the person who is listening to this. If you presented a question, we did not get to it, you can send hate mail to us and with your question, and we promise to address it in an email. So let's take, because I can see there's a couple interesting ones here. So let's do a couple more, but let's stop at 2 hours, okay?
Well, I missed my yoga class already, so I can go on. So
Okay. Well, the next one is good. So why don't you tackle this one? You spoke of inferential warrants. Are there others? And how might these create different arguments?
okay. So maybe the two main ones that one focuses on the most are inferential warrants. So how do you justify the types of analyses that you do empirically? And I think Mikko's example of the healthcare case, that's a kind of a good example of an inferential warrant.
Yeah, these
The
are
twin
inferential
example
warrants.
is a theoretical warrant. So there are two opposing theoretical examples that are sort of that offer different kinds of claims. And then we have processual warrants, which are kind of references towards a particular kind of structure of a process of reasoning, like say reference to Eisenhower 89 multiple case studies, she actually has a stepwise process that's plotted out, and sort of that can be used well. So it can be used in a non-blind way. So if you really read the paper, you understand what she claims that the multiple case method is good for, why you're selecting a certain number of cases, and so on. So that can help. Mike Pratt talks about a boilerplate for sort of for qualitative studies. So and we are doing work on this in another venue, you and I, about qualitative templates. So and there is a productive use of qualitative templates. So processual warrant is like that. And then finally, there's a contextual warrant, which is say you're studying a case that is well known. People might not understand the healthcare needs of the city of Espoo, but sort of you're studying Apple, or you're studying a company, or you're studying automobiles. Most of us understand something about cars, and
Yeah.
then you can get seek for a warrant by referring to your expected common understanding with your audience. So those are the 4 types of warrants that we talk about in the paper.
Yeah.
So this is built on the work that we did in the 2010 AMR, you and I. And I personally feel that this paper is kind of a clearer and a better version of that paper. So that was our first publication together, and I think we're sort of dealing with these topics, and we're kind of pushing that envelope and making it more explicit in this.
Yeah. So we have, and we go through all these in the manuscript, the 4 different kinds of warrants, and a very good example of a contextual warrant is if you study the airlines. Okay, you can argue that Southwest has adopted a low-cost specialist strategy. Even if you have no empirical evidence for it, it is common knowledge that Southwest's competitive strategy is low cost. Okay, so when there's something about the context that can be kind of assumed to be known, then you can use that, you can invoke that as a warrant. And then the process warrant is, and this actually anticipates the next question about the Eisenhardt approach. Yeah, I mean, I can think of dozens, if not hundreds of articles who say we followed Eisenhardt 1989, which means that part of your argument is that you have adopted a formalized methodology, a formalized research design that has been laid out in published work. And then if that warrant is used successfully, that's all the justification you need for your research design. That's a really effective warrant if your audience grants that warrant to you. But do they? This is the next question. Let's bring that on the table here. Is there an opportunity to oppose the face value of citing Eisenhardt 89 and Eisenhardt and Graebner 2007 as an indication of the methodological soundness of the study? So this notion of templates, there's been a discussion on templates. Why don't we talk about templates a little bit?
Yeah, so I think that it's a good question. I would say that yes, there's an opportunity of opposing, and we do that. I personally do that all the time.
Yeah,
but there's no face value of using a particular processual warrant, as opposed to any other type of warrant. So there's no face value of saying that one of the Swin interpretations was the correct one. Or that you should have looked at the location decisions, from a particular angle. So there's no face value, in any of these warrants. So I think it boils down to the question of do we understand what these templates were made to do? They can when used properly, when they're backed properly against this, going to the backing. For instance, why is it that if you're studying a processual issue, if you want to create a process model of some dynamic that you don't understand, I think it's generally a pretty bad idea to do a multiple case study there. So I would go for a single case study, because you're by selecting a multiple case setting, you're sort of, abstracting out of the processes that you could see, closer to the ground. So if I want to understand a process, I would often go for an ethnographic approach rather than a multiple case approach. So, but the problem, obviously, which I think the question is aiming for, is that and actually, so I do think that Eisenhardt is partially, to blame for this, because, for instance, when she published the 89 paper, there was a debate between Dyer and Wilkins and her. They were
Yeah,
published in
yeah,
91, and
yeah.
the response was that better stories, not better constructs. But Dyer and Wilkins were arguing, and
Mm.
Eisenhardt argued that sort of multiple case method, gives you both better stories and better constructs. Uh, and I think that's not correct. So I think that's overreaching. So the multiple case method isn't a method for everything. And
Yeah,
sort of,
yeah,
I think the 89 paper, she does a very good job in explaining what it's good for, and say the notion of theoretical saturation and why you sample certain kinds of cases. And I think it's very elegantly done. It's just that it's one tool in your toolbox. And then there are certain problems, such as, I think, there's an over reliance on interviews in that tradition, which actually isn't necessitated by the research design at
it
all.
isn't. No, it isn't. Yeah,
But
yeah,
but sort of, for instance, the study of decision making by sort of relying on interviews, I think that's not justified. Or to study any kind of practice, just relying on interviews, it makes no sense whatsoever. So there are these kind of embedded traditions and sort of just rules of thumbs and preferences that kind of accumulate, um, into the use of a template like this. And then it becomes, once you're not backing any of those things, then it becomes destructive, I
yeah,
find.
yeah. And I don't want to blame Eisenhower too much, because it's we all have to take responsibility for the work that we do. So
Mm.
I noticed that there is this tendency to read description as prescription. So,
Mm.
a number of cases. Eisenhardt writes that, between 6 and 8 works fine with me, for me.
Mm.
Why
Yeah.
do we read that as prescriptive? So if I say getting up at 6 in the morning works for me, is your
Mm.
conclusion that, oh, Ketokivi wants me to get up at 6? No. So where does this obsession of reading methodological texts as prescriptive, I don't know where that comes from. Because if I get a multiple case study to review,
Yeah.
and the author argues that I picked 6 case studies because Kathy Eisenhardt told me so, I'm going to push back. I'm going to push back and say, you need to convince me that to address your research question,
Mm.
choosing 6 cases the way you have will give you the kind of contrast and the kind of replication that gives you
Mm.
a credible way of addressing the question that you're trying to address. Because obviously, the reason we have 35 cases in the production location study
Mm.
is because we wanted to create contrasts that with 6 case studies would not have been possible. We needed
Yeah.
to get more, but at the same time, we did not want to do a full-scale, large sample study, because we really wanted to immerse ourselves into the individual decisions.
Yeah.
And we found the balance at about 36 cases.
And I think, what you have to understand about qualitative research in particular, sort of where it differs somewhat from sort of quantitative research practice, if you want to draw that distinction, is that the sort of, influential qualitative uh, templates, they're rooted in the practice of some influential individual, who
Mm,
may or may not then write that into a methods paper, often not. So say Eisenhardt is one of the few sort of really influential practitioners of qualitative research who's kind of, formalized it into a very influential paper. Danny Joya, he's been highly resistant to kind of, making his practice a method. Um, he ultimately then he kind of, yielded and wrote the organizational research methods paper with his colleagues, and sort of outlined some of his own principles, but sort of he's very hesitant to argue that you should be doing what I'm doing. So it is just that he's been able to create So there's this is isomorphic, kind of pressures for you that, once we see a sort of, imitation from institutional theory, that we see somebody doing something, doing very well, then we tend to start copying what they
Yeah,
do. And where that
exactly.
comes
Yeah,
from, I think it's like, anxiety that we're really sort of we're struggling with sort of making good arguments, and if we can copy them from somewhere, with that reduces the anxiety. But the real trailblazers of qualitative research, I'm thinking of people like Eisenhardt, Joya, Mintzberg, Anne Langley, Steve Bali, John Van Manen. Many of these are people who kind of blaze the trail, develop a practice for their own. That practice is deeply embedded in what they wanted to understand.
yeah,
And sort of,
precisely,
and it
precisely.
tends to be successful because it was consistent with those aims, in many
Yeah,
ways.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. Let's take one more. I want to take this one because this is really, it goes back to the Schwinn case, and
Mhm.
there's a point here. So there were two possible explanations supported by different warrants. How can it be justified that the first one of the Supreme Court is wrong, or was it just a change of choice after 10 years? Okay, well, first of all, let me suggest that if the Supreme Court of the United States rules something, they're right by definition. Okay, so you can say, I disagree with the Supreme Court's decision, but if they make a decision, they are right in the sense that that becomes a precedent. Okay, so that is now the law of the land. Okay,
Mhm.
so when Supreme Court made the Schwinn ruling, they were right. I mean, of course, they have to justify their decisions. And if you read the prospectus, if you read the legal documents, you can see that they went into great detail.
Mhm.
And the decision wasn't unanimous. There were dissenting opinions that were kind of leaning toward this, but there was nothing wrong with the decision. Here are the warrants, here are the
Mhm.
backings. Okay.
Mhm.
Now, I did mention that 10 years later, the Supreme Court overruled the Schwinn ruling. Okay.
Mhm.
Did they admit that they had been mistaken? No. It's simply because this warrant was replaced.
Mhm.
So there's if you want to look into this in more detail, there are references in our article to
Mhm.
this, but there are kind of two different ways of looking at antitrust. There is the per se illegality principle, and the other is something called the rule of reason principle.
Mhm.
Okay, so what happened in the 1960s and 1970s in the United States was simply that in legal practice and decisions in the Supreme Court, this warrant got
Mhm.
replaced by another warrant. Okay, so, and that is maybe oversimplifying a little bit. One of the reasons why the Schwinn decision was overruled is because the Supreme Court started looking at antitrust cases differently by putting
Mhm.
on different lenses, by adopting different warrants. So the question isn't about right or wrong.
Mhm.
Okay, we might argue that if your warrants don't have a backing, then you're wrong in some
Yeah.
sense. But things get interesting when we have alternative arguments,
Mhm.
alternative explanations that are erected on warrants that do have backings.
Yeah.
That's when things get interesting. So it
Okay.
is essentially it is a change of choice after 10 years. That's not so. There is no notion that the Supreme Court was first mistaken, then they saw the light. No, it was just a change.
Okay. So I'd like to do brief answers to two more questions. So I think we
Okay,
have actually addressed a lot of the questions that are below, but sort of two more questions I think would warrant an answer. Any
okay.
recommendation how our qualitative and quantitative researchers could work together to publish papers in top journals? I saw this question in the chat yesterday, and I think it's a fascinating question. I would first ask why would we want this? So, I'm not saying that we wouldn't, but sort of I'd like to understand what would be the purpose of a mixed methods case, or sort of mixed methods paper. So, that we often entertain a belief that research is somehow better if it's mixed methods, and that's I don't think that's justified. So it depends on the type of thing that we study, but let's assume that we want to do this, that we want to do a mixed method study. I think there's the key thing here again is reasoning. That sort of then we need to be able to communicate the ways in which we reason, and sort of we have to rely on each other's competence in sort of drawing the conclusions in a justified way. Because I think one of the things that I'm seeing is that to learn qualitative methods well, you actually have to kind of get integrated into traditions of interpretation that sort of lie outside our field. As statistics lies outside our field for quant scholars, you actually have to get into hermeneutics. You have to get into different traditions of sort of how texts are interpreted to be able to do that kind of work. And that's an investment. And sort of we can't be experts of everything. So if we collaborate, I think that's the basis of it's something that the CEO of the Finnish Academy once told me, Heikki Mannila, that sort of people often forget that for multidisciplinarity to work, you have to have disciplinarity for that. So multidisciplinarity best works with sort of disciplinary experts who are broad-minded and are able to bring some strong disciplinary foundation to the table. So I think that would be my. So if you understand that you truly want to do this, then sort of you need to make sure that happens, and you're able to communicate that how is it that I reason. That you need to be able to communicate to me about your reasoning for using a particular statistical test for something, to the extent that I understand it, and you have to understand it. You have to be a disciplinary expert there.
Yeah. To me, multidisciplinary work is very difficult, probably impossible. Probably impossible. Okay, you and I are probably never going to work on an empirical paper because I do not have training in qualitative methods. I do not want to have my name in an empirical article unless I understand the methodology throughout, not just half of it. But I've been in presentations when a multidisciplinary team has presented and somebody has asked a question and the person has said, okay, I'm not an expert on this, so I'm going to yield to my colleague. I think you lose all credibility if your name is in the paper, but you don't understand it well enough to describe it. So to me, interdisciplinary means that Oliver Williamson combined law economics and organization theory into transaction cost economics. So you have to have expertise and command of different disciplines inside your own head. Okay, so when I think of interdisciplinary, I think of individual people, James March, Herbert Simon, Oliver Williamson, and others. But if you have a team of 5 sociologists and 5 economists, how are they going to work together? They haven't read the same literature. They don't use the same methods. They don't read the same theories the same. How do you work in it? It seems I'd hate to work in that kind of a setting where everyone is expert on something different, and then we are expected to produce an output that is a joint effort. I don't understand.
Actually, sort of, I might push back on that. I think knowing you tend to be intellectually very curious. So I think you might enjoy working in a sort of qualitative setting and sort of doing that. But sort of it takes a lot of effort, and I would say that for you in particular, you would probably fare pretty well in a setting because you bring a very strong disciplinary understanding to the table. So there could be an interchange there. So I think I hope that, I think one thing that we can probably agree on is that sort of we see a lot of really weak research that claims to be multidisciplinary. So when you have a PhD student that comes to you that says that I want to do multidisciplinary work, I think that's a recipe for disaster often. Often, just based on experience, for the reason that being a jack of all trades is very hard, and it's sort of creating a profound understanding of several disciplines, say during a PhD process. It's well, there are some geniuses among us, perhaps.
Yeah, but not just but how many senior researchers do you know who have a profound understanding of multiple, I mean, really profound understanding
Yeah.
of multiple disciplines? Not many names come to mind. I'd say,
But yeah, let's just say that you're a pretty good philosopher by now, because you don't have a degree in philosophy, but you've been sort of really
I don't, but I would
your,
never ever, I would never ever go and teach even intro philosophy at the university level. I would not.
yeah, but in a sort of, in a sense, our work in a sense is multidisciplinary in some sense.
Sure.
So,
Yeah.
or interdisciplinary, and so on. So I wouldn't be super pessimistic, but sort of, I think, to answer the question, so if you truly want to do that, it is much harder than people often expect. Multidisciplinarity is often used as a kind of an excuse for not knowing anything well, and sort of doing sort of
Yeah.
really bad work. But sort of when it's done properly, it's relying on sort of really understanding the processes of reasoning well.
I would go to the processes of reason. I would pay really close attention to warrants in
Mm,
particular. If you're trying to combine ideas,
mm,
then I mean, for you to still have coherent argument structure, I mean, I think that's going to be the challenge. Can you take a theory from sociology and theory from economics and create an argument that has warrants, that invokes warrants from both, that are not contradictory or
mm.
independent of one another? I think that maintaining coherence, I think, is the challenge.
No.
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
I think, well, that there was let's just deal with this very briefly. There's a question about ideology that I think was pretty interesting. That warrants and claims are influenced by values. In the antitrust example,
Hmm.
now we're talking about Google and Facebook. How does a reviewer handle the value and ideology inherent in the author's judging a manuscript? So I think my answer here is reflexivity. So that's
Hmm.
that in qualitative research we deal with value judgments. It is kind of inherent when you're reading a text. And that's, when
Yeah.
I was teaching my PhD students, the intro class to qualitative methods is to have them read a text, an op-ed piece from The Economist, which was about Brexit, and sort of then we try to figure out different ways of reading that text, and sort of immediately bump into your own values and your own emotions and stuff in doing that. And the
Hmm.
device that you're using is that sort of the more reflexivity you can bring to the table. And there are devices in qualitative research in particular where you can sort of really step back, take a breath, and sort of don't judge yourself in sort of having those beliefs, and uncovering, take joy in sort of understanding more about yourself, and then make a more informed decision about interpretation. But with warrants as well, so it's a selection of a warrant, in a sense, can be treated as a process of interpretation. The Swin example is a process of interpreting the significance of what you're seeing.
Yeah.
So that
And
would be my answer. I don't know how you.
yeah, I think ultimately, you know, we have warrants and backings, and I suppose backings have backings and backings have backings, and so on and so forth. But so I guess everything is ultimately about value judgment and ideology. Okay.
Mm,
The notion of endorsing the importance of credible arguments.
mm,
I mean, that's an ideology, isn't it? Okay, we are
mm,
proposing that this is something that is valuable, needs to be taken seriously, and not just for instrumental purposes, but because this is what scientists do.
mm,
Okay, and the same thing if you look at, look at the conundrum, with Google and Facebook and
mm,
all these companies that can sway elections
mm,
and that have become so influential.
mm,
Okay. And indeed, if you look at the antitrust cases today, a lot of the conversation is about values.
mm,
What kinds of values? So, of course, there is the classic principle of anything a company does that harms consumers
mm,
should be red flagged. That's often in antitrust cases. The question is there harm to consumers?
mm,
But in the case of Amazon, things are tricky because you could argue that Amazon, I love Amazon. if I need a cable, an obscure cable that costs $90 at El Corte Inglés, I can have a guy at my door 10 a.m. tomorrow bringing it to me for $16.99. I love Amazon. But at the same time, we know what the antitrust concerns are with Amazon. It's just so big, so influential that it's actually able to change the structure of the market. But when we think about this and present arguments, of course we invoke ideologies. It's just impossible not to. But just realize, just being cognizant of the fact that that's what we do. That's what we do. Don't think that you can't. Don't say, let's look at this objectively. No, you can't. That you can't do that. So, but I don't know if reviewers need to deal with this as much. I don't find myself having to deal with ideology.
It depends on, again, sort of what level of a value system you're talking about. So, the word ideology, that's Marx's term, and Marx referred to ideology as the kind of a dominant value system that obfuscates itself, its true nature, and then oppresses others through that. It is a fair enough sort of ideology is used in very different ways. The word, but I think the Marx origin is informative here, that sort of if we are really imposing our values towards others without being explicit about them, that's when this goes back to the very beginning, the checklist, the three things that this is a nice kind of way of concluding this, perhaps, that if the three things that we're saying is that you need to understand what the claim is, you need to understand how the authors are trying to justify it, and then come to a conclusion of sort of, is that justification sound or not? Do you accept that? So that's where we're promoting that these are I stuck my head out both yesterday and today and said that for me that's kind of that those are minimal criteria for scientific practice. Those are values, but sort of at least we're being open about them. If you want to push back, feel free, and let's sort of the demarcation between science and non-science is difficult, and sort of I'm more than happy to have a debate about that. But sort of if I'm open about as a reviewer, often perhaps people, I'm just expecting people to accept that as a given, that those are sort of the editor to take those to be legitimate concerns for a reviewer. But sort of if a reviewer, if the editor or the authors, they push back and say that, hey, sort of these are not fair expectations, then let's have a value debate, and rather than me imposing my ideology on you. Some
questions are questions about values, some are questions of methodology, and just being able to make the distinction, and so that we don't talk about policy as if it were methodology or vice versa, so that we understand what we're talking about and what we're agreeing or disagreeing about. All right. Okay. So we went about 2 hours here. So to the person listening to this, if you made it this far, very, very impressive. We thank you. And we thank everyone who attended yesterday and anyone listening and watching to this for paying attention to this. And we hope that this sparks a conversation. It can be a very local conversation, but let's hope that it'll be really interesting to see where this goes and how people react to this, and how we will change the way we think about this and do research and construct arguments when we come to work Monday morning. I mean, that's the ultimate test, and that's in many ways the only thing I care about is, what kind of a splash can this make? What kind of a process can this start so that we pay more attention to the structure of arguments? All right. Very good. And thank you to you, Saku, as well, for yesterday and for this conversation. As always, I've learned a lot, and let's see where this goes. All right. Very good. Thank you all.
Bye, everybody.